Today, we think of redemptive historical interpretation as a fundamentally important way of reading the Bible and recognizing the progression of revelation from the Garden of Eden all the way through to the end and all that involves. But in the 17th century, there's not a lot of redemptive historical interpretation. And Coxe comes along and he recognizes how God reveals himself to us through the historical covenants that are recorded in the Bible.
Well, hello and welcome to the Broken Wharfe podcast. My name's John Mark and I'm joined by my co-host,
Johnny Woodrow. Welcome to the Wharfe. John Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing absolutely splendidly because
really?
I have my co-host back alongside me. It's a good feeling.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's nice. It's been a little while, hasn't it? Life gets busy and things, but I'm very pleased to be back in the chair alongside your good self, who brings order and direction to every podcast we're part of. I'm very pleased about that, and my random thoughts get posted into some sort of order. And you've got an agenda for today, haven't you? Tell us about that.
Well, I do. I thought with us announcing the new launch of Covenant Theology from Adam to Christ, we are publishing a 20th anniversary edition. It is available for pre-order this month. I thought we could discuss covenant theology and Nehemiah Coxe and some of these questions and invite to join us a very special guest, someone known to our listeners, I'm sure, Dr. James Renihan. How are you, Doc? Tell the listeners how you're doing.
I'm doing very well, thanks. Nice to see both of you.
Jolly good.
That was a very, very short and stark welcome. We appreciate shortness because
you told him
Johnny and I. Yeah, Johnny and I do far too much waffle. Let's begin our discussion with this point. Doc, why don't you tell us something about who Nehemiah Coxe was? Give us a short biography of the gentleman who wrote the book, A Discourse of the Covenants, found in this new volume.
Well, he was a pastor in London in the second half of the 17th century, grandson of a Church of England clergyman, and son of a man who was also a Church of England clergyman, but came to Credo-Baptist convictions in the 1640s. Nehemiah Coxe was born in 1650. Possibly he was born late in 1649. He was raised in Bedford. He was born in Bedford, raised there, was part of John Bunyan's Congregational Church in Bedford. There are things about him I wish I knew that I don't. I don't know where he studied, what university he went to, but he obviously had a very good education. He was called to be a gifted brother in the Bedford church on the same day that Bunyan was called to be an elder in that church, was there for several years, and then was called to the Petty Friends Church in London and became one of the two pastors of that church. That was probably the largest particular Baptist church in London. They had well over 500 members. He was, I think, precocious in that he was 27 years old when he was involved in a couple of really important publishing works. There was a fellow who was sent out from William Kiffin's Devonshire Square Church to the West Country, Somerset, Devon, and he went off the deep end theologically. He really became a heretic. There was a bad controversy, and the London elders asked Coxe to get involved. He spoke to Collier, who didn't like the fact that a young man was addressing him. He wrote a very profound theological book called A Vindication of the Truth that Broken Wharfe published last year. He was 27 years old when he wrote that. He also, I think that the circumstantial evidence is very strong. At the same time, our Confession of Faith was published first in 1677, and I think the circumstantial evidence is strong that he and his co-pastor, William Collins, were the two editors of that Confession of Faith. When I talk about it, when I speak about it, I like to ask the question, what were you doing when you were 27? Now, I know, John Mark, you're not 27 yet. So, the standard is high for you to get there. Johnny and I are well past it at this point in our lives. Then in 1680, he published this book, A Discourse of the Covenants that you mentioned. Later on, earned a medical degree in the Netherlands, and then died, sadly, in 1689, before the General Assembly was held in September. So he died at about 39 years of age. But from my view, probably the most important particular Baptist of the 17th century in terms of theology. You get someone like Benjamin Keach, who was a voluminous writer. I'm not convinced that all of Keach's work is useful. Where everything that Coxe wrote is useful. So there was an ordination sermon that he preached. It was, someone mentioned that it's the first public ordination that was held during a period of persecution. He preached it, and then it was published. And then the other work that he did is a biography of one of the important Huguenot theologians earlier on in the 17th century. So not a huge body of work, but a profound body of work, anyways.
Sorry, I just had a quick question. One is just, do you think John Mark Broken Wharfe might put out those two works? I can see a sermon appended to the biography work. But my other question then was going to be, one of the works that was published last year, The Vindication of the Truth, had a particular historical moment. There was an issue to be addressed. So it's very clear what the context in which that work was produced. Why did he produce this work on covenant theology? I'm assuming that it's not simply because he just wanted to put out something on why we should be Credo Baptists.
Well, we'd have to surmise the reason for that. I don't know that we can definitively state what's going on. But it is 1680 is a period of persecution, a period of difficulty, a period in which the Church of England has had 20 years to restore its power, the authority of the bishops. It's a time of political unrest. The dissenters or the nonconformists at that point perhaps needed opportunity to express who they were. And it's a fair question, Johnny, but right now I don't have a good answer for it.
This isn't historical. I haven't got a historical argument for it either. But I do wonder, having taught through Sam's book, used Sam Renihan's book on the covenants.
I know him.
Yeah, you know him. You're friends.
Yeah.
You've hung out for a bit.
A little bit.
In the sort of theological refit that our church has undergone. So, as a pastor, thinking, what do we need in order to be the church and understand the gospel? We've had to rethink and understand the doctrine of God. Well, at the time, there's quite a lot of good, solid work going on the doctrine of God, was there not? Understand the two natures. Well, Nehemiah Coxe had tackled heresy around the two natures. And the third topic we've discovered is, if we're going to know who God is, who is this one who came to us? What is it that he came into? And the covenants are crucial. This one who comes as the Christ comes in the role of and in the place of this covenantal role, in terms of the promises to David and the Davidic covenant, which takes you to the other covenants. Then to understand the gospel, we need to know who God is, how this one takes on flesh, or how to describe that, and then why and into what context. And the covenantal context is essential for the gospel. So I suppose I appreciate Cox's work and Sam's work as well, which is also published in the UK by Broken Wharfe, because of the three big topics, if you could say there are three big architectural topics of the Christian faith: who God is, who Jesus is, and what he came to do. Covenant theology and a robust covenant theology at that period would have been vitally important, because it was not yet written, was it? I mean, John Owen was beginning to, wasn't he? But yeah, I don't know. Just some thoughts.
Well, I think that's a reasonable suggestion, especially because you find John Owen at the same time publishing his work on the book of Hebrews, where he expresses further covenantal ideas that are very similar to what Coxe proposes. And that's why originally we put the two together. Coxe says in his introduction that he had gathered material for a second volume that would deal with the covenants after the law, but he was happily prevented because Dr. Owen has recently published on Hebrews 8. And so maybe that's evidence that among the nonconformists there is a discussion that's taking place, and it was necessary, or, well, important, as you said, to express what the Savior came to do and how he came to do that.
It's why this book, I think, is particularly important to particular Baptists. That's a repeated use of the word particular there, but it's why it's been so important for the last 20 years since its first publication. It's interesting, you mentioned Keach Doc. Wasn't there a comment from Keach on Cox's work that he thought it was helpful but a little complicated for the ordinary man, or am I misquoting Keach there?
Yeah. You're not exactly quoting him, but that was the gist of what he was saying. Yeah, it's very useful, but a challenge to read for the ordinary person.
Of course, Keach can sometimes be a challenge to read for the ordinary person as well, but we will just gloss over that.
Yeah, that's right.
And considering this work, we've had mention of John Owen, and his treatment of Hebrews 8 is really endorsed by Coxe. He goes to write on the covenants following the Abrahamic covenant, and he simply says, I was withheld because John Owen published his commentary on Hebrews chapter 8. And we've had mention, of course, of Cox's own work, A Discourse of the Covenant, and those two come together to make up this book, originally published and edited by you, Dr. Renihan, under the name of Covenant Theology, From Adam to Christ. Why is it important that we read this book afresh today? Why is it important for this book to be highlighted again? And what sort of influence has it had in your life and your understanding of theology over the years?
I can remember when I found it in a reel of microfilm 30 plus years ago. And when I read it, I realized that it was a very different uh, approach to the expression of covenant theology, in that it's redemptive historical, which, looking back for us, or let me put it this way: today we think of redemptive historical interpretation as a fundamentally important way of reading the Bible and recognizing the progression of revelation from the Garden of Eden all the way through to the end, and all that involves. But in the 17th century, there's not a lot of redemptive historical interpretation. And Coxe comes along and he recognizes how God reveals himself to us through the historical covenants that are recorded in the Bible. It's a really refreshing approach. I don't know if we have any Pedo-Baptists who will be listening to this, but do you mind if I get controversial for a moment? Is that okay? All right. Johnny's, let's go. Well, I think that Pedo-Baptist covenant theology was developed originally by Zwingli and then followed by others as a more evangelical support for the practice of infant baptism. So it was infant baptism that was driving the covenant theology that we are familiar with. And the covenant theology, the traditional kind of covenant theology that you find in most books, either by Presbyterians or even by some Baptists, really leads to infant baptism. That's the inevitable conclusion of it. When Coxe is writing, he's moving away from that, and I think that it's his study of covenant theology that provides a really helpful support for the practice of credo baptism. Now, there's precursors. Matthew Bingham, in his book Orthodox Radicals, makes the point that the covenant theology you find in the first London Confessions, the three versions, comes out of the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church and their nascent congregationalism as they're working their way through ecclesiology. And I think Matt is right. I think he's exactly right. So Coxe is not the first one to introduce this thinking. I think writing in 1677, there's a maturity over those years. Well, 1680, I'm sorry. There's the thinking among the particular Baptists has matured, and it brings us to the point where Nehemiah Coxe is able to write in the way that he did. So, as I discovered this, and as I read it and thought about it and considered, of course, he sent me off to Owen for reading Hebrews chapter 8 and Owen's comments on that. I realized that this is a really useful, profound understanding of what covenant theology is that helps us not just with our identity, but with a means by which we are able to express our doctrine of believers' baptism in light of the progressive revelation that we have through the historical covenants in the Bible. One of the questions I've asked myself over the years is, which came first, believers' baptism or covenant theology? And my answer is covenant theology begins with the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church and the group that develops believers' baptism out of that. And then you see a progression through certain writers up until you get to 1680 and Coxe's writing. So to me, it's a wonderful statement of the theology of the Bible that helps to support what our practice is.
I think as well, the way that you presented the historical context there, it shows the importance of congregationalism and ecclesiology being read through that lens of how Coxe and others in the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church really understood the unfolding of the covenants. People often say, and I'm not going to say whether this is substantiated or not, I can leave that for our listeners, but people often say that pedobaptism is a practice in search of a theology. But from
I
what you're
decided not
saying,
to say that. You said it. It was in my mind, but I wasn't going to say that. But you're right.
the cat is out of the bag. Hopefully we don't get any hate mail. I actually think all the pedobaptists I know are fairly kind people, so hopefully they'll be generous. But people say that. Are you suggesting that really people cannot level such an accusation against Coxe and his fellow particular Baptist brothers in this year simply because it is so clear that they are in search of the implications of their covenant theology in ecclesiology and so forth through these years?
Yes, and let me go back to what Johnny said before. I think that soteriology and ecclesiology have an intersection at this point, and that intersection is reflected in this maturing theology that's included or that's expressed in Cox's book.
Covenant theology is getting going in the 17th century, isn't it? Is that? But it's also, but it's not only the straightforwardly orthodox that are up to it. There's a guy, I never know how to pronounce his name. Coccesius or somebody.
Coxeus.
Okay. Is it he's beginning to press the covenants at some. I'm just getting at what else is going on around the time other than the baptism and ecclesiology sort of discussion that actually has people begin to read the Bible in terms of covenants. I've always had this sort of slightly sort of back of a scribbled on a beer mat idea that in the Reformation period in the 16th century, people are trying to press again justification by faith, which means you have to read the Bible in light of the gospel again. And I've also sort of had it in my head that what they kind of overdid was overcooked the gospel, their reading of using the gospel to read all the covenants of the Old Testament, because that's justification by faith must be there. It's sort of fully formed in some sense in all of them. And so the Abrahamic covenant is just entirely all of grace, because they're trying to now read the Bible through grace, because it's grace has been reasserted again, and that shaped their Bible reading. And then you move forward 100 years, and it's starting to the Reformation settling down, and it's no longer sort of just on the back foot, as it were, but they now have institutions. They're producing larger tomes. The kind of literature is no longer just polemical. They're starting to lay out curriculum. They've got universities. They're beginning to do a bit of a deeper dive. That covenant theology and a more nuanced approach to progressive revelation would just have been of course that began to happen, and it sort of starts to happen in the 17th century. Would that be a fair reading off the back of my beer mat when I just scribbled that down, that timeline down?
Well, I think that we do have to go a little bit earlier, and it's really Zwingli in Zurich and the appearance of the earliest Anabaptists in Zurich that begins the process in his mind of developing a kind of covenant theology. By the way, we're not Anabaptists, just in case anybody's wondering. You have to say that whenever you use that word. That's not us, right? Coxeus precedes Nehemiah Coxe, and he was somewhat controversial in the way that he laid out his covenant theology, because it is on the spectrum. It's much more redemptive historical than traditionally was expressed prior to him. So in Coxe cites Coxeus at times in his book on A Discourse of the Covenants. So that's part of the stream moving things forward. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Nehemiah is helped by Coxeus in what he reads, and that produces in him that thinking. So it's not the same as you might find in a traditional Presbyterian form. What Coxeus, of course, being on the continent, doesn't have all of the influences of the English-speaking Presbyterians. Well, I guess they all would have been ready in Latin, anyways. But he doesn't have that kind of immediate influence upon him. So he develops this new redemptive historical trajectory, and Nehemiah Coxe, I'm getting mixed up with Coxeus and Coxe here.
Oh no, yes.
Yeah, Nehemiah gets certainly is helped by what he reads from Coxeus, but applies it even further by beginning the process of working through covenant of works, Abrahamic covenant, Mosaic covenant. That's what the book is about, those three. And then it's Owen who picks that up with the Mosaic covenant especially, and moves it forward to Christ.
John Mark, I've just got a question. Can I just pick up on a theme that's just begun to emerge and try and tie it into something relevant today? So, Dr. Renihan, you've been talking about a redemptive historical approach and covenants, and sometimes those two things don't come together, do they? Having read Coxe, having read Sam Renihan's book, I'm surprised I ever understood anything of what we'd call biblical theology today without understanding covenants. But I really did learn about biblical theology, the redemptive historical promise to fulfillment reading of the Bible, without covenants, other than mentioning Abraham as an important turning point in the Bible. So, what are we? I suppose what are we missing when we just do this new modern sort of biblical theology without covenant theology today?
What are we missing?
And so, therefore, what would reading Coxe help? What would he do for our understanding of biblical theology?
Well, on the one hand, you end up with dispensationalism.
Interesting, right?
Which is, in an attempt to read the Bible in terms of progressive revelation, it just chops it up into a variety of epics. And so I think it fits, pardon me, within the broader scope of biblical theology, although we would say it's an aberrant biblical theology for sure. That's one thing that you would potentially end up with if you tried to do biblical theology without a robust covenant theology. I think on the other hand, you end up with infant baptism. If you have covenant theology without a robust biblical theology.
Interesting.
Because now I know that the vast majority of men who have written very fine books on biblical theology are also men who baptize babies. Maybe not the vast majority, but many of them. Although I'm told that you find things in men like Ritterboss that sound like the arguments that we make, but I haven't gone and looked those up myself.
I know your son Sam Renihan makes that point when you trace kingdoms, the theme of kingdoms through Ritterboss, as opposed to covenants. He ends up making some good distinctions between the Old and New Covenant on the theme of kingdom. I think I've heard him say that.
Yeah, I think so too. But I've had, I sat in on a course on covenant theology in Quebec a couple of weeks ago, taught by Mike Beck, a friend from New Zealand. And he was making the point that Ritterboss has these observations as well. So I think that's a reality. You need both of these things together. You need the covenant theology, which is a sub-discipline of systematic theology, and you need biblical theology, and they direct and they influence each other.
Do you think, I've just thought of another one, I sort of, not having a covenant theology, or I did have one, I just didn't know it when I was very deep into biblical theology, wound up as what you might call a new covenant theologian, but didn't know it. So didn't really know what to do with the moral law, and those sorts of categories. So when there's no functioning or well articulated, well thought through covenant theology, but a big emphasis on um, progressive revelation and those sorts of themes, it, I wasn't going to end up as a dispensationalist. I wonder though if another place you end up, which is similar, is in that new covenant perspective on moral law, because you just don't have the equipment. You don't have the conceptual equipment to talk about the difference between moral and positive law and those kinds of things that comes in the kit bag of covenant theology. Just another one. I wonder if that's another symptom of. So you might end up with. Here's a thought: you might end up with churches that are either dual policy on baptism, which is an increasing thing because it becomes a personal thing, not something built into Revelation. And you might end up with a functional new law to live by, because that's also no longer disciplined by covenant theology. So you could end up with, I can think of a few, those are trends in modern church life. I wonder if they're addressed by covenant theology in a book like this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Johnny. That's a good observation to make. You know what's running through my mind right now is, let me change the terminology completely. We're talking about the intersection between the two, biblical theology and covenant theology, or I really want to say systematic theology. But there's a sense in which the analogy of Scripture and the analogy of faith are active here as well. The analogy of Scripture, to some degree, describes what biblical theology is all about. That we take a text and we set it into the whole canon and work through how the canon affects that text. The analogy of faith calls us to interpret certain difficult passages in light of the entire faith that is revealed to us in the Word of God. Well, the one is biblical theology, the other is systematic theology. That they help us to work through it. I think that what you just said is an example of those two things. So I realize the terms are not absolutely synonymous, but I think that they can apply and they can help us to think through these relationships.
It seems that what you're both driving at here, which is really useful for understanding Coxe and the importance of his writings today, is that he really gives a corrective to that pedo-Baptist overemphasis on systematic covenant theology by bringing this wonderful, I want to use the word synergy, but it might be better to say harmony, this harmony between the analogy of Scripture, the analogy of faith, and the redemptive, progressive, unfolding purposes of God in the Old Covenant, and the systematic understanding of what exactly is being accomplished. It seems that if we were to read Coxe more today, then we might not fall into some of these pitfalls that have been mentioned. Dispensationalism, New Covenant theology, there are so many. Progressive covenantalism is another that has been grown recently. It seems that it really gives us guardrails against some of those mistakes and pitfalls.
Yeah, I think progressive covenantalism it has a very heavy emphasis on biblical theology without the discipline of systematic theology. And it allows its advocates to hold views about the moral law that don't see a continuity. They want to say if a commandment isn't repeated expressly in the New Testament, it's not enforced any longer. They're not Sabbatarian in the way that they view the week and the day of worship that we observe. Good point, John Mark.
Maybe we can close with some thoughts on this topic. Doc, what would you say? You may have already summarized these. I'm I'm just thinking now, there have been some helpful lessons already, but what would you say some of the lessons are that we learn from Coxe's covenant theology from Adam to Christ?
Um, in terms of methodology, I think it's very helpful in that he really works closely with the text of Scripture. And whether or not you agree with all of the points that he makes, I think he does a very fine job of helping us to understand the importance of thinking through the text and its implication and the text in light of the canon, the rest of the canon. So I would say that that's helpful. Secondly, I think his emphasis on the historical nature of the covenant of works is really important. So many in the last 50, 60, 70 years have abandoned the doctrine of the covenant of works, which really undermines the doctrine of justification by faith alone. But they've abandoned it sometimes under the influence of well-known seminary professors who've written the term isn't found in the first few chapters of Genesis, therefore we need to rename it as the Adamic administration or such things. I think that his work on the covenant of works helps us to recognize how important it is, how foundational it is really for the rest of the doctrine that we believe, for us, especially our soteriology. So I think that that's great. His survey of the Noahic covenant is useful. His work on the Abrahamic covenant, which deals not just with the text in Genesis 12, 15, and 17, but also with its New Testament appearances and how Paul or the rest of the apostles understood what was going on in the Abrahamic covenant. Stephen, for example, just before he's martyred, speaking about the covenant of circumcision, Nehemiah Coxe opens that up and helps us to understand what Stephen means by that. I think it's there are all kinds of good things. Now, let's admit, number one, it's a 17th century piece of literature. Number two, it is, as Benjamin Keach rightly observed, somewhat of a challenge at times to read. But I think it's easier than reading some of John Owen's stuff, to be honest. But you work at it, you get through it, and you find a lot of benefit and a lot of help.
Thank you very much for those points. Maybe before we close, listeners can hop onto YouTube if you're not watching this already and just get a glimpse of Johnny's fine 1689 t-shirt. What a fitting t-shirt. I don't know if you want to show the listeners, Johnny,
Just a second.
the 1689
I think you can get the
merchandise.
1689, although it could have said 1677, so there's an opportunity for the manufacturer to produce another version. There we go. If only Broken Wharfe
With the
had
right
a
date
t-shirt
on.
like this with this quality of fabric, weight of fabric, and printing. I'd wear one. Would you wear one, John Mark? If you could get a picture of that boat on riding the waves of the book, that wonderful logo, it's pretty excellent, wouldn't it? Product recognition, brand recognition.
I certainly would.
We've got merch like that too. If anyone wants IRBS shirts and things.
Well, Jim, I was working out in my IRBS shirt this morning.
All right.
Yeah, it
Good
was
for
because
you.
it's a very cool. It's cool in both the senses. But if there was a Broken Wharfe t-shirt, you'd wear one, wouldn't you, Jim?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The IRBS
Darren.
t-shirts are particularly comfortable. I don't know what fabric is used, but it's
good
very,
quality.
very comfy. So
it is. Yeah. Yeah. Good merch. Good merch there from IRBS. We should learn from our brothers who are teaching us the confession from the States.
It's like our faculty, top notch.
Top notch. Excellent.
Absolutely. And to finish on a serious note, thank you so much, Dr. Renihan, for joining us today. And thank you above all for putting this work into print originally. I know that it was you with the 2 other editors and the work of Dr. Barcelos, Richard Barcelos, through RBAP, putting that work into print. So thank you above all for bringing this work to us. Nehemiah Coxe, Covenant Theology from Adam to Christ. It's his Discourse of the Covenants matched with John Owen's writing on Hebrews chapter 8. And if you'd like to get a pre-order copy of that work, you can head over to brokenwharfe.com/bookshop. Thanks to the listeners. Write any comments or questions that you have for future episodes. If you write enough, we may even be able to convince Doc to join us again to answer all your questions about pedobaptism after he shook the boat in today's episode. Thanks again, and bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.